We're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPAC, BRAC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
We're going to go ahead and get started. We have an absolutely wonderful session. We're very excited. I've been looking forward to this all year. And so we're very excited about our panel, very excited about everyone that's here. Absolutely anticipating all of your wonderful questions, and we're planning to come together and learn a lot. I am Councilwoman Tyra Wicker. I'm the Councilwoman for District 10 here in the city of Baton Rouge, and I'd like to welcome you to the Creating the Best Blight-Flight Toolbox session. As many of you are aware, blight is something that is not something that affects just certain communities. It's one that we found really affects communities all across the country. We are no stranger to the impact and the effects of blight here in our city, which is, of course, one of the reasons why we're so excited that CPAC has put together this session. We are planning to learn from all of the best tools and strategies from all across the country. Here in Baton Rouge, we have did a very, very focused effort on blight. Myself, along with one of my colleagues on the council, felt so passionately about the issue of blight and the impact that it has on our community, not only in terms of just the quality of life, but also the economic value of our community, the way that people view our city when they actually come here, the way that we even move and circulate and communicate among one another. Blight impacts our lives. So we decided as policymakers, believe it or not, to come together to attack the issue holistically, looking at different policies that actually were negatively impacting or were not being effective in helping us to address the issues of blight. So we formed a committee, worked along with the administration, and everyone that we could pull to the table that had an interest in blight to try to come up with strategies and solutions to remedy this issue. And we're issuing a policy paper coming up shortly, but we're very excited about the experts that we have here today with us that's going to give us ideas and strategies and tools on how to best address this and things that's been done all across the country. And so if you're in this session, that means that, of course, you want to learn about techniques and tools available to clean up blighted properties and hear national and local examples illustrating equitable and sustainable community revitalization. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this session, Stone Pigman. We're really excited that for your sponsorship, and thank you so very much. Also, I'd like to remind individuals here that all attendees, this session has been approved for 1.5 hours of continuing legal education. So all you have to do is see one of the CPAC staff members to get your forms and submit that to them after the session, and they will get you taken care of. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panel speakers. First, we have Calvin Gladney. He is the president and CEO of Smart Growth America. Calvin is a nationally recognized thought leader on equitable and sustainable revitalizations of community. Prior to being with SGA, he was the managing partner of Mosaic Urban and has worked in over 25 cities across the country. Next, we have with us Kevin Wright. He is the principal of Yard & Company. Kevin is the co-founder and principal at Yard & Company, which is an urban growth firm focused on urban design, planning, and real estate development projects in North America and abroad. Kevin is a leader in community development, economic and real estate development finance, planning, and placemaking. Next, we have with us Ms. Brenda M. Breaux. She's the executive director of the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority. Brenda personifies leadership through strong business acumen, passion, commitment to excellence. As executive director to New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, Brenda is responsible for providing strategic leadership, stability, and growth opportunities for the authority and the communities we serve. And finally, we have Christopher J. Tyson. Christopher is the president and CEO of the East Baton Rouge Parish Redevelopment Authority. He is the president of the authority, where he leads Baton Rouge's land development and blight elimination efforts. I want to just mention this as well. Christopher has a very, very long bio, and he's done absolutely so much. And I said, Chris, what do you want me to say? And he's like, oh, Tari, don't say anything. But he has so many great things. I just want to note that Christopher also is a noted expert on local government, as well as urban land use and development. And his bio is available. He has so many things that he's accomplished. We're so excited to have him here. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panels. They're going to actually speak to you in the order that they were introduced. And so first, we will have as our first presenter, Calvin Gladney. Let's give him a hand, y'all.
I wanted to attend the 50th anniversary event. I think Chris's bio is long because he's old. Is that right, Chris? He's a friend. I can do that. How's everybody doing? I just got off the plane, literally maybe 20 minutes ago, so it's been a harrowing day, but we're going to have a little fun and talk about blight. As you heard from the bios and just the little excerpts, I'm working with, this panel is a panel of experts, so I wanted to sort of get in where I could fit in, and since these guys are going to talk directly about blight and talk about how to deal with blight, I wanted to talk about what I'll call the precursors to blight, the things that happen before blight becomes a thing, and talk about how we deal with that and how that relates to the idea of Smart Growth America. So Smart Growth America, we kind of have a vision, a mission. We call it our North Star, where we envision a country where no matter where you live or no matter who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And there's no way to have healthy people, live a resilient life, and live in a walkable urban environment, or even if it's not urban, if you have blight. And so it's really important to us to think about how do we deal with getting to the place where it doesn't matter what part of the country you're in, urban, suburban, it doesn't matter who you are, so that's questions of equity. How do you get to that result? And what we've done is we've said, well, we can't just be a housing or land use organization. And we can't just be a transportation or infrastructure organization. And we can't just focus on workforce or economic development. All of the issues are interconnected, and therefore we need to bring kind of interdisciplinary solutions to the table, and therefore we work on all of those issues simultaneously. And that's the idea of how we get to this concept of smart growth. But you have to do those things and still figure out how does that relate to blight, and if you're working on transportation and infrastructure and land use, but you're not talking about being a developer, you're not talking about dealing with the buildings themselves, well, how does that relate to blight, and how can we be helpful? So, and I just highlighted kind of the places that, again, we want healthier people. We're trying to make sure that people can share in the prosperity that happens when you revitalize a place. And make sure that they can be resilient and deal with things as they come, whether it's climate or otherwise. And so we think about blight and we think about, residential buildings, vacant buildings and the like. You might think of commercial buildings where they're vacant, maybe there's a mural put in place, it doesn't look the way you want it to look, it hasn't been populated. But one question is, how do we actually end up here, and what are the things we can do before we get to the point where we actually have to fight blight? And that's where, to a certain extent, Smart Growth America comes in as we work on transportation, land use, infrastructure, and economic development issues. And those are the places where I think there's a fight that's a precursor to blight. Blight precursors. So I want to just put them all on the screen all at once so you can kind of see them. Infrastructure investments, transportation decisions, and our land use rules. Those are three places where we make decisions that lead to the blight that you visually see in properties and in land. And the question is, before we even get to the point where the panel can tell you what to do once there's already blight, maybe we can counteract some of these decisions and these kind of precursors to blight and maybe never get there. Infrastructure investments. And so you see here kind of corroded pipes. And I just wanted to give you a quick personal example. So I grew up in a small town in New York called Brooklyn. Anybody heard of Brooklyn? And actually grew up in a neighborhood, and it is a neighborhood called Coney Island. Anybody been to Coney Island? Awesome, awesome. And so this is the barber shop that I went to every week growing up in Coney Island. And this is what the barber shop looked like right after Hurricane Sandy. And so that blight, now most of those chairs are now gone, but those storefronts in that area has never really recovered, and it doesn't look the same as it did, and it really comes down to the decisions that were made on infrastructure before you got to blight. And so that's a perfect example of if you make the wrong infrastructure investments, or frankly, if you're inequitable in how you make infrastructure investments, it can ultimately lead to blight. And so as opposed to looking at the vacant storefront or the dilapidated storefront and saying that's blight, let's fix it, you might do things on the infrastructure side that can stop it from ever getting there. Just a personal example. And if you go to Flint, and you think about this water, and this is actually running water from a sink in Flint, Michigan at one point, not only sort of blighted stomachs, but if you think about all of the people that left the area because of those poor infrastructure investments that led to the water being this way, then you can see how there are precursors to blight, and some of it relates to infrastructure. Transportation decisions. Has anybody here seen an overpass that's cut through a neighborhood and messed up a community? And has anybody ever thought it seems to disproportionately happen to communities of color? So transportation decisions, way before you get to the moment when there's a building that's vacant, a storefront that's dilapidated, you can make these decisions on transportation where you put a highway through a neighborhood, and the next thing you know, one side of the neighborhood becomes, as the saying goes, the other side of the tracks. So transportation decisions, before you ever get to housing being dilapidated, before you get to these blight outcomes that are physical and visual, sometimes happens because of transportation investments and how we make those decisions. And finally, kind of near and dear to our heart at Smart Growth America are our land use decisions. Does anybody look at this picture and think of the S word? Anybody want to call it out? Sprawl. And so you can make decisions to build out neighborhoods like this, towns like this, and spend the money it takes and the infrastructure and the time to build out an area that looks like this. And money is finite. Investments are finite. Resources are finite. And so when you look at, well, you put all this money into building out this neighborhood, which isn't smart growth, and then you say, well, where are the resources that could have been put into urban areas? And that also leads to blight. Another version of this is a quick little visual that I actually got from a New York City zoning code. And Smart Growth America runs a nonprofit called the Form-Based Codes Institute, primarily to fight these issues. How many people here know that walkable urban environments lead to kind of livable places? Is that sort of a precept that we all believe? But a lot of zoning codes around the country went too far with that and said, we need to have retail on the bottom of every building. Sometimes your zoning code can lead to blight. We like to use form-based codes that say, we don't necessarily care what the use is, we just want the visual and the aesthetics and the scale and the size of the properties to do a certain set of things, but we're not going to dictate to you what the use is. And what happens sometimes in land use rules is we dictate a retail use on the bottom of the building. That leads to blight because the market can't support that retail, can't support that commercial use, and therefore then you see a dilapidated storefront 5 years later and you say, why is there blight? And so, blight. I don't know if anybody here is a Game of Thrones fan, but blight is one of those things that it sort of starts here and it kind of flows, and the next thing you know, it goes crazy. And so we have to think not just how do we fight blight, but how do we fight the precursors to blight? Transportation decisions, infrastructure investments, and the way we use our land. And sometimes that can help us get to a place that we never end up with blight in the first place. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to wander a little bit, so I'm going to mess with the audio guy up there. Might go back and forth. It's hard to follow a Game of Thrones reference, but I'll try. My name's Kevin. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a process that at our company we refer to as demand discovery. It's a demand-based approach to planning, development, and in this case for today's presentation, dealing with blight. Now, see if I can figure this out. Okay. So one of my problems with our industry being a kind of a comprehensive term, but in this case, planning, development, community development, policy making, you name it, is that when we think about bringing back places, neighborhoods, cities, et cetera, we spend the majority of our time, if not all of it, thinking about supply and not enough about demand. So when we look at a corridor or a neighborhood or a block, we look at it and we say, how can we fix this? And typically our approach is a very expensive streetscape, or let's build a park, or let's do a dense $50 million mixed-use development, or let's install some expensive transit. And as you'll hear me talk about, all that is fine and good, but there's another way to think about it as well. And so if we can take a demand approach to planning and development and blight removal, can we discover and create demand together as a community? And if we can that demand discovery process lead to smarter, faster, and more inclusive outcomes? We have learned in our work the answer to that is yes, and I'm going to walk you through some case studies that show that, and I'm going to talk fast because this guy's going to show me a stop sign in like 7 minutes. So, as mentioned in the previous, in the opening, we're with Yard & Company, and we're an urban growth firm who's using this demand discovery process to do planning and design work around the country. I always start with this diagram. This is a diagram that, to me, shows the traditional planning and development model. So let's get everybody in a room in a community for a period of weeks. We go to the church, we go to the gymnasium, we put dots on maps, we talk 10, 15-year visions, we talk about strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, threats. We adopt the plan. The experts, which a lot of us are, go to work. And Calvin actually touched on this. What happens is, before anything's built, is a lot of time goes by. And then typically what's built is some compromise of what people said they wanted in their neighborhood. And what Calvin touched on was that it's because there's no market. So we may have said, we want a beautiful building with retail on the ground floor, and then 3-4 years go by, that building comes out of the ground, and it doesn't have retail. Why is that? Because we're subsidizing our way to a building, and the developer or the market is telling us that retail won't work. And then the outcome is, after 2-3 years, the neighborhood gets upset. If you're a planner, you've probably been yelled at in a meeting, that's what happens. And it's those same people who, on the left-hand side of the diagram, 2-3 years ago, showed up and said they wanted it. But they don't remember that, and they don't like what they're seeing now. So our approach, when we do this sort of work, we shove these two pieces in the middle. We still keep the bookends, planning and development, but the two parts in the middle are what we call demand discovery. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit here with a couple case studies. Those two pieces are build demand and smart small. So right after that plan ends, how can we take that same sweat equity that the neighborhood's putting it in and start discovering demand creator together, telling our story, creating demand for our neighborhood, and how can that lead to smart, small, incremental wins, maybe an adaptive reuse of a building, a rehab of an old firehouse into a restaurant, which I'll show an example of. And then how can that make the bigger process, the larger catalytic infill development that we all want, happen smarter and be more inclusive to the neighborhood and happen faster? There we go. So I'm going to start in Bellevue, Kentucky. So I don't know if anybody knows Cincinnati well, but Bellevue, Kentucky is right across the river from Cincinnati. If you don't know Cincinnati well, you probably don't even know that Kentucky's right across the river from Cincinnati, but it is. Bellevue, Kentucky is a small town of 5,000 people. Here in Bellevue, there was a vacant building, which you see here in a parking lot, that was listed for sale. Some neighborhood residents came to us and they said, we really want this building to become a restaurant. There's not enough nightlife in our business district, and we want to see more nightlife. And so we said, okay, let's do it. And we got together with them and we said, what's the story you're trying to uncover? And they said, you know what, we really want to show that Bellevue is true Kentucky. If you know Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky apologizes for being Kentucky. They often, we refer to them as Ohio Light. So they say, oh, come on over here, we're not Kentucky, we're not so bad, we're not the South. Right? But these guys, what they wanted to do was they wanted to put their flag in the ground and say, we are the South. We're bourbon, we're horse racing, we're bluegrass. So they created something called the Old Kentucky Makers Market. They used child labor. very cheap, spent virtually no money on this project. They had music, they spray painted some barrels with the logo, and this is what happened. They filled the parking lot in the alley behind the space, hundreds of people every weekend, vendors that were local makers, drew tons of people in, changed the story of Bellevue over a matter of months. And in that process, as this was all going on, the building sold. A young couple came to one of these events, and they said, you know what, I like the vibe of this place. Cool building, cool neighborhood. We actually, really quick example here, what we uncovered in this process that we had a stroller parking problem. So the majority of people who showed up walked, and they had young kids. So it showed us that young families were the market demand in the neighborhood. This young couple bought the building, started construction on it recently. It's going to be called the Fairfield Market. It's going to be a local market during the day, good coffee, good food. At night, it's going to be a bourbon bar. Again, tying right back to that activation and demand discovery that was done by the people in the neighborhood and is now completely reshaping this edge of the business district. Over in Cincinnati, Ohio, I used to run a CDC. I ran a community development corporation over there in a neighborhood called Walnut Hills for 7 years. And when I started out, I had no idea what I was doing. I was new to the profession. I was lucky to be working in a TIF district, and so we had purchased several buildings that were blighted and that needed to be redeveloped, but nobody wanted to redevelop them. And my job was to somehow get people to come invest millions of their dollars in our neighborhood. So what we did was, instead of only focusing on the supply side work, we found a series of alleys behind these buildings that were a crime problem, a blight problem, and we cleaned them out. And then the next day, we had a pop-up beer garden. And I'm going to cut this story really short for sake of time, but over the course of months, we repeated this over and over again. And what we uncovered is that there was a pent-up demand for people to walk to something in Walnut Hills. And after 2 or 3 of these events, as they grew to become some of the most popular events in Cincinnati that summer, we brought in retailers and we brought in developers to say, this is why you should invest here. This is your market study. And over the course of time, we were a community-based organization. We got some pushback from the neighborhood on, what is this? This is happening fast. We aren't ready for this level of change. And so we began working with the community council to say, if we're shaping demand through this alley project, through these programming strategies that we're implementing, and we're now seeing people starting to come in, open shops, developers are interested, how can we use that same demand discovery strategy to shape supply in a more inclusive way? And so we started using that same strategy to influence development around minority-owned businesses, affordable housing, inclusive public spaces, and shaped our strategies around programming relevant to that outcome. And then, in my first diagram, I mentioned build demand, and I mentioned smart small. Our first development was the renovation of that firehouse that I mentioned. A small $300,000 renovation, 1 restaurant, 1 apartment, very low risk, not a lot of subsidy from the city. And yet this took that demand discovery methodology, put it in a building, and showed that it could work. And since then, in the last 5 years, we've followed that with over $50 million of mixed-use investment in this corridor. And it's happened faster, smarter, and more inclusively than any other neighborhood has seen growth happen in that 5 years. So you guys, if you were in the room for the previous presentation, you saw Tommy talking about Memphis. He actually mentioned this a little bit, but I'm going to touch on it. This is my last case study. In Memphis, we were hired to come in and do a master plan as part of a team for Uptown Memphis, which is a huge area. As Tommy said, they created a $95 million TIF, and they had to figure out how to use that TIF to equitably remove blight and grow Uptown Memphis. And part of our job was to go out into the community and figure out how to use that money. What were the priorities and what did the neighborhood want? And so what we did was, instead of just, and this is a picture of the gymnasium, but instead of just being in the gymnasium doing the typical charrette model, we went out into the neighborhood. So we organized bike rides. It's amazing what you see in a neighborhood when you walk or bike as opposed to driving. We popped up in cafes at lunchtime, coffee shops in the morning, and we met people where they were. We didn't ask them to come to our meeting with our agenda. We met them where they were, and we talked to them. We learned. We held a block party. We held a block party in a building that they wanted to see renovated so that we could see what it felt like with 100 people in it and take photos of it and show the world that this looks like a pretty great space. We still ended up with the beautiful drawings of the 15-year vision and the plan, but what we realized when we were doing the work around Memphis, uptown Memphis, this is a map of it, is that there is no one solution. It's a huge area. It's, I think, 10 different neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has a different market condition. So why would we take the same supply-side strategies for the entire district when everybody's at a different starting point? And so that whole process informed that there were actually 4 market conditions in uptown Memphis. Sluggish and slow were the first 2. And so what we did was we developed a toolkit, a supply and demand toolkit for removal of blight. Whoops, a little error message. I guess that means I'm out of time. And we developed different tools based on the market conditions. So in a sluggish market condition, mini grants for the community, targeted code enforcement. Moving to more moderate or rapid market conditions, and the rapid ones, we talked about form-based code. You're starting to see a lot of infill development. You need a code that can influence infill development. In the slow market condition, no one wants to invest there. It's a totally different toolkit. So I'm going to end with this slide because I'm out of time, and it is my last slide. As we think about it on this panel today, and as you guys are at the Smart Growth Summit, I want you to think, these 2 sentences may seem a little weird to you, but it's important to think this way, I think, for us moving into the future as planners and developers and community organizers. That demand discovery, influencing demand, can shape supply. That's your left hand. With your right hand, supply can also shape demand. So it's not a straight line, it's more of a circle. As demand shapes supply and you begin to grow as a community, you don't stop doing the demand work because you want to continually shape what happens in your neighborhood, because growth can cause problems too, not just lack of growth. So with that, thank you. I'll hand it off.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? All right, I'm going to start with a video, just an overview of the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority and the work that we've been doing. We've been fortunate enough to be 50 years old, and we're going to start with that.
The story of New Orleans is a story of rebirth.
It's more than 300 years of reimagining and reinvention.
Today, the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority continues that story.
NORA was founded in 1968
to revitalize underinvested neighborhoods across the city.
And since the storm, our mission has continued to evolve and grow.
How do you restore the places and spaces where we live, work, and play?
Our comprehensive approach targets specific needs to catalyze change.
New construction and historic renovation turn blighted buildings into sustainable homes.
Empty lots into affordable housing.
The places that current and future generations of New Orleanians call home.
Our residential projects are responsible for hundreds of first-time homeowners
and form a critical mass for growing neighborhoods across the city.
Central to those neighborhoods are the businesses that anchor them.
The places we work,
make groceries,
where we dine out,
or catch a show.
We work to strengthen commercial corridors with investments that benefit the surrounding communities.
Our gap financing investments fund large-scale commercial developments that transform corridors and quality of life.
Our facade improvement projects restore and beautify the businesses and storefronts that are already in place.
Land stewardship programs embrace nature in New Orleans.
Quiet spaces for reflection with an emphasis on the beauty and resilience of our city environment.
Urban farms and forests reimagine unoccupied lots as intentional green spaces.
And stormwater management projects reduce flood risk to make communities more sustainable in the face of a changing climate.
This is not an empty space.
There is history here.
A past with traditions to honor,
but also a future full of potential.
Something new that could be.
Something that will be.
When it's reborn,
reimagined,
reinvented by the city that's been reinventing itself for over 300 years.
We have the vision.
We see the potential
for a resilient and sustainable New Orleans.
All right. Thank you all. What I'm here for today is to talk about blight, but one of the things that we are doing with the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority is not, we have a posture that our work is not singularly focused. Our work doesn't address community development on a one-pronged approach. It has an appreciation of commercial, residential development, and land stewardship, which we really refer to as green infrastructure. It's those three legs for a community and what we see needs to be in a community. What you will see before us is the mission of the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority. We're a catalyst for the revitalization of the city, partnering in neighborhoods in affordable, and as Calvin mentioned, equitable strategic developments that celebrate the neighborhoods and we honor the traditions. Our major program areas are residential, commercial revitalization, and land stewardship. And on our residential piece, I'm wanting to highlight some of the things that we have been doing to address blight. Blight, not necessarily in the sense of a blighted neighborhood per se, but bringing vacant properties back into commerce, addressing some of the needs that are in our communities and our areas where there have been lots of disinvestment. What are some of the tools that we have utilized over the course of the past few years that we've seen in the city that we've been responsible for? And working on targeted development in target near areas where there have been long history of disinvestment. We look at market value analysis. We've worked with the reinvestment fund in investing in a tool that looks at the market over a period of time in order to determine where do we best put in our investments? Where will we see the best bang for our bucks? And what we've done over the course of the past 3 iterations of that has helped to drive not only where we want to invest. We're now utilizing that tool throughout the entire city where others utilize that and making decisions both on a public sector level, but both on a private sector level as well. We've also been addressing our affordable housing, which various tools that we utilize, but also recognize that we have a responsibility for housing opportunities for all. And that includes individuals who are interested in market rate housing. We recognize that the people that we service are not just one income level, but how do we service those individuals collectively? This is just an overview of the market value analysis, and it just provides just a roadmap, a colored roadmap at that, but a roadmap of where we see our investments. And clearly areas that are in the A, B, C, and D areas aren't areas that organizations such as the Redevelopment Authority ought to be investing in. but it's in those transitional neighborhoods where we see that investments make more sense, where we see that public subsidy makes sense. It's in those E, F, G, H, and I markets that you see. And this is just an overview of what those are. I'm going to go quickly. One of the areas that we targeted in our part of our work was the Lower Ninth Ward, and looking at where we would make those investments. There is a lot of, as a result of the past hurricane in New Orleans, that was an area that was largely homeowner. That area, as a result of the storm, became vacant. We became the recipient of a lot of vacant lots. Where do we put those investments, and how do we incentivize investments to go in those areas? As we mentioned, Calvin mentioned some of the decisions we make with respect to infrastructure, which can be bridges, which can be interstates. All of that impacts what we do. And some of our targeted developments has taken place in the Lower Ninth Ward, and how we've concentrated on that, but not just on that part of the city. We've created products so that we address some of those issues. We help subsidize some of those through some of the work that we're doing and helping to subsidize those. We recognize that development in and of itself in some of those areas of disinvestment will not take place without some public subsidy and some interventions. And that means that as public entities, we have to do some of that. But we also have to do that with some of our private partners as well. I'm going to highlight just some of those, overview of some of those. I see my friends here at Neighborhood Restoration here, but I don't have one of your projects here, but it's on here. And then what you see is where we are and some of that other stuff. We work with our state partners, with the Louisiana Housing Corp, in an effort to try and fulfill some of that. This is just some of that for market rate housing that you see. Again, we provide land and subsidy in some instances, and others we provide just subsidy. That's an overview of what our leverage has been, what we've invested just on the housing development side. And we can't leave out our commercial revitalization component. We provide gap financing, we provide facade financing and facade grants for small businesses along some of our commercial corridors where there have been long areas of times of disinvestment. And then one of our, again, this is a major renovation that we participated in. Our money is just merely gap financing, but recognizing that it were not for our money, these projects lots of times would not go forward. I'm just going to highlight all of that. That's an overview of all of our commercial revitalization. I've gotten the stop sign twice. All right, thank you. And then I recognize that all space, every piece of land, highest and best use may not necessarily be housing. We recognize that. And as identified in the video, we made green space available and our participation with some of our other lots with respect to some greening infrastructure. I'd like to thank you all.
Good afternoon. Last but not least, I'm Christopher Tyson, President and CEO of the East Baton Rouge Redevelopment Authority. And I think all of the presenters have left us with insights that I certainly will touch upon in my very brief presentation, which will not be aided by a PowerPoint. But I hope I can just talk to you for a second about the East Baton Rouge Redevelopment Authority and our work around blight remediation and the challenges that we face here in Baton Rouge. We indeed want to congratulate the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority for 50 years again, and that's an interesting contrast for us because right up the road here in Baton Rouge, our redevelopment authority will be operational for only 10 years next year. We were established in 2007 by statute, began operating in 2009. And so we are still a relatively young redevelopment authority. And as a city, we are a young community in dealing with coordinated redevelopment entities that think comprehensively about redeveloping the built environment. But the Redevelopment Authority has been busy in the 10 years that it has been in existence. We've done a number of programs around land banking, around gap financing, facade improvements, planning efforts. We have, as you may know, the electric depot development underway, and look forward to that delivering its first phase next month. And we also have our Ardendale development, 200 acres of land in the middle of the city, which has spurred the development of a community college, the Baton Rouge Community College Automotive Center, and many more developments there to come. So we've been busy, but there's still a lot more left to do. And if you ride around Baton Rouge, you'll understand the unique challenges that we face with regards to blight and coordinated development that the Redevelopment Authority works every day to tackle. I'm a Baton Rouge native, born and raised here. With the exception of 13 years, I've lived my whole life here. And so I can speak candidly about the virtues of this beautiful city, but also its challenges. And I'll skip over some of the virtues to get to the challenges since we're talking about blight. We know that as we ride through Baton Rouge, we are today more than ever a tale of two cities. And many cities can claim to be a tale of two cities in how you experience them. But Baton Rouge spatially is a tale of two cities. And the sprawl and the low-density, automobile-oriented development that characterizes the built environment throughout the Metroplex the consequences of that are most intensely felt in the neighborhoods of North Baton Rouge, where most of our blight issues are concentrated. And we have to be very honest about that when we talk about blight in Baton Rouge, because it is the elephant in our collective living room. And we know that that history is inextricably linked to our challenges with race and class inequality. And as those problems magnify, issues with blight and deteriorating spaces grow. And as I like to tell people as I'm talking about these challenges that in my Baton Rouge people will understand the reference. When companies come here to look for Baton Rouge as a place to locate, when young professionals and those we would like to locate here move to visit Baton Rouge, they don't see Scotlandville or Santa Maria. They don't see PQ or Plank. They see one community that can't seem to get its act together to fix these gaping, pressing issues. That's what they see. And so addressing these blight issues, particularly with regards to the maldistribution of opportunity and resources, is all of our issue. Right? No matter where we live in this city. And that's something that the Redevelopment Authority is very aware of. There are challenges in dealing with this. Again, we are a young redevelopment authority, and as Councilwoman Wicker can attest to, we are still as a city figuring out how to integrate the various entities that are responsible for land management. Integrate those processes and integrate those resources so that we can actually mobilize the necessary resources to address those issues. So I like to think about how do we address the entire life cycle of property from distress to development. If we're just thinking about blight as cleaning up trash, right? As tearing down dilapidated buildings, but we have no end use for that property, then it will sit. It will sit as a vacant lot, and it will inevitably be a target for additional dumping, for additional decline. It will drag down neighboring property values in neighborhoods with strained resources and other social issues. These lots will be the gathering places for illicit activity. There are a whole host of issues that happen when we don't think comprehensively about the entire cycle from distress to development. We also know that we are a mid-sized city developed almost primarily in the 20th century. Most of Baton Rouge that you experience today happened after the arrival of Standard Oil in 1909, which means that most of our development conventions occurred under patterns that prioritize automobile development, automobile transportation, and racial segregation. We are a disconnected city, right? We are one that sits in a lot of traffic, much more than our size would otherwise suggest. In those kind of legacy issues continue to dog development in neighborhoods, particularly those that are overburdened by a collection of blighted properties. That also ties into our issues with quality of place and placemaking. Most of our development is low-density, strip-center development behind acres of parking on roads with no sidewalks. And it's very hard to create places that are attractive for investment and for activity in those instances. So we have to find ways to retrofit out of that. We know in Louisiana we have legal challenges with clearing title to blighted and distressed property. And the cost of clearing those challenges, those titles, continue to burden redevelopment efforts. It's something that we think about every day. We've launched a partnership recently with the Southern University Law Center, where law students will be helping us with some of the abstracting work. Those of you who know the enormity of this problem know that that is just one step. And we need many more resources to address the problem of clearing title so that we can actually create the catalytic projects that put property back into commerce and revitalize neighborhoods. And then we have to ask, and certainly drawn from Calvin's insights on the precursors to blight, and Kevin as well talked about being demand-driven. And so we always have to ask, we are redeveloping for whom? We are redeveloping for who? Are we redeveloping for the people who live in the neighborhoods that have been beset with a lack of resources, with disinvestment over decades and decades and decades? And how do we create places and amenities and services and quality affordable housing in those neighborhoods when for so long development has evaded these neighborhoods, and indeed we've lacked the political will to do so. It takes a change of heart in the community and a massive redirection of resources to accomplish that, and that's something else that we're also aware of. I will say to you, though, this is an exciting time in this city's trajectory to be talking about coordinated land development, blight elimination, equitable development, revitalizing neighborhoods, and quality of place. There are many, many people doing great work in Baton Rouge, and many more people interested in expanding and building upon that work. And that is the space that the Redevelopment Authority finds ourselves in today. And so we're excited and we're encouraged. We are aware of the scope of the challenges, but we are certainly not dismayed by them. And we believe that Baton Rouge has a lot to teach the nation about equitable, place-based revitalization and development, that we have problems here that are not our own. Many cities around the nation face these challenges, and so we look forward to being innovative and being proactive and collaborative as we address these challenges, particularly around the blighted properties and the disinvestment we see in too much of our city. With that, I look forward to your questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Let's give our panel guests another round of applause, y'all. They did a really great job. I don't know how far I can get with this. So we're gonna, now as in the words of one of our local news medias, now it's our turn. It's your turn. And so we're gonna have an opportunity to pose questions to our panel guests. Any of you that may have questions, there's a mic that's gonna be traveling around, I believe. Okay. I just wanna share one quick thing with you. The issue of blight is one that plagues, as we have heard all throughout this morning, communities all across the United States, and is a frequent topic of discussion, obviously within the walls of government. Blighted conditions are those which create a hazardous condition to the public health, safety, and welfare. In addition, occupied residential homes, public spaces, vacant lots, abandoned and industrial buildings can all be subjected to the characteristics of blight. These conditions contribute to a loss of revenue for the city, create environments that can lead to increased crime, increases of fire in vacant dwellings, and expose public to a greater health and environmental risk. And why did I read that? So I wanted to just kind of bring this up close and personal because, you know, we've had sort of this whole thing going on, and we've been trying to figure out in the city of Baton Rouge, what's the indicator? You know, what's the problem? What's the issue? And we recognize that there's a myriad of issues and there's a myriad of problems. But one of the things that I've learned recently, many of you may or may not know, in addition to being a councilwoman, in addition to being the mother of 6 children, my husband and I also pastor a local church. And so as a pastor's wife, one of the things you better do is read your Bible, right? So I'm reading one day, and I'm reading the word, and guess what's in there? Blight. Did y'all know it was in the Bible? And it's literally listed as a plague in the community. And so, of course, that literally got my attention. So now I'm all wound up about it, not just from the political side, but from the spiritual side, because I do believe that it's something that at the core of our community eats away at the very fabric of who we are as human beings and as communities. And we were just driving around through the community not long ago. And, you know, as we become creatures of habit, and so we'll drive through and we'll go to work, we'll go to church, we'll go through the neighborhood the same way every day and pass by blighted conditions, and we get so immune to it that we'll forget that it's even there. And so when the visitors were here, we had a chance to tour through my district. And it was unbelievable because things that I had passed through and passed by on a daily basis, all of a sudden I had this amazing man, Mr. Jason Roberts, in my car, and he says, but you know, that can be this. And that can be this. And so all of a sudden, my eyes and my vision was open into what the possibilities were. And so I want to, again, thank our panel guests for just allowing us the opportunity to see things from a perspective that ordinarily we may forget and may not even be aware that's there. I want to bring up just one question because they gave me the opportunity, but they made the mistake and gave me the mic. But I want to say this really quickly. One issue that I did not necessarily hear a lot about, and I think probably Kevin may have alluded to it, is the issue of gentrification as it relates to when you're coming back and dealing with blighted communities and bringing communities back from the brink. And so I want to give you guys an opportunity because I know that we've had several conversations and discussions about the issue of when we're bringing these communities back, these underserved communities, what's the issue as it relates, or the solutions as it relates to potential gentrification of these areas? Anybody? Yes.
Well, this might be a little controversial, but I think we have a vocabulary problem.
Okay.
The issue is not gentrification. The issue is displacement. Gentrification means that new people with new income are coming to a neighborhood. That's not inherently bad. What's bad is the people who've lived in that neighborhood over the years, the business owners who have been proprietors of services and products in that neighborhood, aren't able to share in the prosperity that comes when the neighborhood is revitalized. So we should stop trying to prevent gentrification, but try to mitigate displacement. And so if you think about that and say, okay, now we need to fight displacement, then you need to bifurcate that into how do we mitigate residential displacement versus small business displacement. Because the tools to deal with those two issues differ. We may not have time to get into all of that, but the main point for me is to, one, we have to say that our fight is against displacement, not against gentrification. And the other thing is, a lot of what we think about gentrification is just half right. So we picture gentrification as mostly being typically younger white people moving older people of color out of neighborhoods. I work around the country, but if you go to Houston, it's younger Latinos moving older Latinos out of neighborhoods. I was a gentrifier in my neighborhood in DC. There was an older African-American person that lived in the house before I did. So we have to be clear not only on vocabulary, but making sure that we understand what we should be fighting versus what we're fighting just because it's more political or it's sort of the hot topic of the day.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else want to address that issue?
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. And I agree with you, Calvin, on the vocabulary, because we do mistake it in the community and confuse it. But as a community person, all you see is that end result. And so what do you tell yourself as policymakers, implementators, of how do I help to resolve that? So what I look at is that trying to ward off displacement. What tools are available to me to ensure that those individuals who want to stay there in that community continue to stay there? Do I develop some other kind of programs to allow for them to live there? Do I develop other programs to encourage others who might meet some of those requirements of those people who potentially would be displaced? And with putting those in there, I also need to address some of the businesses and the business issues for some of those small businesses who have been in those communities for years who are not going to reap the benefits. One of the things we did was come up with our facade program. It was a grant to small businesses that were in along corridors where there was lots of investments, and we saw the big G coming down the street, the gentrification taking place or getting ready to take place. So what did we do for the businesses to ensure that they benefited from whatever might happen in that neighborhood, and also putting some of our public investments in housing in those areas so that some of those individuals yet would still be provided an opportunity, and creating some home ownership opportunities in those areas for some of those individuals who were low to moderate income. I've seen those two interventions, and we've implemented some of those in those areas where the big G was coming down the street.
Yeah, so kind of following Calvin, I also kind of want to expand our scope a little bit in talking about this. When we talk about gentrification and displacement, we're talking about cycles of marginalization that tend to compound previous cycles of marginalization that typically people of color and people of low incomes are facing, in particular spatialized contexts, right? Neighborhoods and what have you. But gentrification and the displacement that can follow is a problem of competition for space, right? There is less supply than there is demand, prices raise up, people get displaced, neighborhoods change. And in low regulatory environments where there are no affordable housing controls or rent controls or whatever, people are easily displaced. That is one problem. You know, here in Baton Rouge, when we talk about what do cities that don't have the development kind of profile, economic profile, or the workforce dynamics and demographic changes of the large urbans, what do those cities face? Well, we have different cycles of marginalization too, whereas gentrification and displacement is a type of marginalization. We have a marginalization by invisibility. What happens when there are no demand drivers sending people into certain neighborhoods? There is no competition for space. There are no hordes of young professionals who want to live above a Starbucks in a $250,000 loft condo looking for space in poor black neighborhoods that are going to end up displacing those people. What happens when literally those people don't even know the neighborhoods exist? So we can talk about marginalization by displacement, and that is certainly what is happening in many markets around the country. But we also have to be aware of marginalization by invisibility. And what do you do when you have neighborhood markets where you don't even have the competition for space, where no one is coming in, no one is looking to invest, and people lack services, they lack quality housing, blight is concentrated and growing. That is, I believe, and I think those of us in Baton Rouge thinking about this would attest to, is a different problem to solve, right, than the kind of traditional gentrification frame. So I want to be sure that we acknowledge the nuance there with regards to the different types of marginalization that occur in different types of cities.
So what do you suggest then, Chris? Because what I hear is, and I agree with you, what that tells me is that is an opportunity for targeted investment. That's an opportunity for government and private sector to say that we're going to invest and participate in this. Because what you do in those instances is you've got to create the market. And when creating the market might mean you might have to bear a little bit more than what you would ordinarily bear in a typical transaction. That means you've got to bear the market and create the market. Create some of that synergy that Kevin talked about earlier, and trying to create that and make that a place of investment, a destination and place where people want to go and to do the things that you want them to do. I think you gave a great example, Kevin, in your approach as to how you might look at a neighborhood. And you looked at the community and saw what they wanted, but it wasn't there yet. So you helped to build upon that.
Right. And I'm not sure we all need this mic. I think Calvin is the only one who broke his. No, I just had to make that joke. No, I think this is a really interesting conversation. I think going back to the original point, and then it's kind of trickled around. I do think I don't know if the vocabulary problem is the right way to say it, but my biggest concern about the gentrification conversation is it's sort of take it or leave it. It's either development and growth is bad, and we should be scared of it no matter where we live, or let the tide roll in and pro gentrification, pro development. And the answer lies somewhere, I think, more in the middle. And all places, as I mentioned in the Memphis example, are not created equal. They're not at the same starting point. And we're having an argument in Cincinnati right now about Airbnb regulation. And it's because in one neighborhood over the Rhine, which you guys visited when you were in town, is exploding with development. And so people are starting to rent out their units on Airbnb, which is creating an affordable housing problem. So the policymakers are now passing a regulation for Airbnb that will be blanket-wide, citywide. When, in my opinion, we should be looking at the market conditions of the different neighborhoods and saying, you know what, we would love people to start investing in Airbnb in neighborhood X, and we should control it in neighborhood Y. And you start to take that same approach with tax abatements, facade improvements. In this neighborhood, we need facade improvements for minority-owned businesses. In this neighborhood, we don't need that because no one is investing there. We need a demand-based approach to growth. And I'm really interested in how the sort of data innovation sector can help measure when we turn the corner in that. So is it when a certain number of building permits gets pulled, a little buzzer goes off in some bureaucrat's office that says, okay, we're now in this market condition in this neighborhood, we should enact these restrictions. Because in some neighborhoods, you actually absolutely should ask developers to give a lot towards social impact issues, and in some neighborhoods, you want to literally give them the building. So, okay. My 2 cents on that.
Good deal. Questions from the audience? I know y'all have a question.
Don't be shy.
I can't see. Any questions? There we are.
This is really for anyone, even Councilwoman Wicker. Chris, you talked a lot about airtight, clearing airtight. And have we seen any best practices, whether it's from a policy standpoint, whether it's from a legislative standpoint, in addressing clearing air title and just getting those properties into commerce?
So, for those of you that are way up at the top, the question was in dealing with clearing of air titles.
I know it's bad if you pass it, because you all have had success.
We've had success with some. I'm going to say, first of all, we're a property rights state. We believe in property rights and individuals' property rights, and individuals who may have had ownership interests of a property 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and who may have abandoned that ownership interest to create some of this blight that exists out here, and have failed to pay taxes for 40 years, and still support the property rights. So I would say that there is no silver bullet. I'll put it that way. We know at the Redevelopment Authority, because we've worked through that over the course of the past 50 years, but more importantly, over the past 15 to 17 years, concentrating on just that. There are a lot of ways in which you work toward clearing title. Each property comes with their own set of issues. and its own set of variables, whether it's a formally tax adjudicated property, whether or not it's a property that just has outstanding taxes, whether or not they have transferred the property 30 times and forgot an heir from way back, remember when. All of that takes place. So there isn't any one thing. What I can say is that it's something that you work at it every day on a property by property issue. We've gone through as much as having conversations with the title insurance underwriters on some of those tax adjudicated properties, trying to get some of those cleared and worked through. It depends on what the nuance of the issue is with respect to some. I know the state has been working through all of that through the state's Office of Community Development. So there is no silver bullet, I'll say that. It just becomes as to how much risk are you willing to bear at the end of the day if you're the owner or have the largest ownership interest in a particular piece of property. Yes. I know you've worked on it, Chris, for a number of years and even gotten Southern to assist with that.
I knew I wasn't going to be able to say anything about this that you wouldn't already know or be able to cover. I think the last point you made is right on. What we're ultimately talking about is how comfortable can you get a title insurance underwriter to write a policy, right? What level of risk are they going to accept? And that is a result of what level of investigation and due diligence has been done to make them comfortable that there is not some claim out there that is going to, come home to roost one day after significant capital has been put at risk into developing this property. That is, at the end of the day, the challenge. So one of the things that we're trying to think about as we expand our land bank, and the Redevelopment Authority in Baton Rouge has had a very small land bank for the last several years, and we've made some significant expansion of that, is to think about, number one, when we take property into the land bank, in addition to clearing the title, we have to insure that property and we have to maintain that property. Now, the good thing therein is that is a blight remediation strategy, right? That is some accountability, particularly if the city itself is resource constrained with regards to code enforcement, condemnations, blight clearance, so on and so forth. Clearing the title in many cases is going to be the most expensive part of that, particularly if you don't have students helping or through some sort of clinic or something. If you're paying a billable hour rate to do that kind of title work, it's going to be difficult. But that's the challenge that I think we find ourselves in. It is a property by property basis, and the challenge is getting the critical mass of resources to be able to work through that, so that you're seeing which properties you can actually take to an underwriter and get them to agree to underwrite, and which properties are you're going to have to take a different approach.
We have about 2 more minutes, and I know Calvin wanted to say something on that issue real quick. You're good? Any other questions? Yes. So there's one here.
I think part of the challenge is, in the beginning, understanding that it's a two-way street. I think often we describe these challenges as either there's a villain who's moving into the neighborhood and there's a victim that lives in the neighborhood. And so I was working on a project. We had a project which was called Gentrification Without Displacement down in Memphis, Tennessee. Had to remember where, because you had it on the slide. And part of the discussion that we had was during our engagement process to make sure that everyone was in the room, not just the usual sort of rabble-rousers that come out to meetings, but business owners that tend to not come to meetings unless you have them at different times than their business hours, church leaders and the like. So have engagement at different times so you can get a different audience. The point of getting the different audience is to get them in the room to say, hey, if you come in and you move into a neighborhood and there's a vacant building and you put a coffee shop in there, you might say to yourself, I haven't displaced anybody. This building was vacant. So why are people mad at me? I'm actually bringing a service to the neighborhood. And the residents say, well, I see that guy with the plaid shirt and the beard and the Edison light bulbs, and this ain't for me. So you have to have the two-way conversation with those folks to say, one, hey, community member, if you actually go to the coffee shop, you'll find that the prices of the coffee are the same prices as the diner that you go to often. And so it is accessible to you in terms of price. Some of it is an information gap. Secondly, you say to the business owner, part of your challenge is you need to do affirmative outreach to the community. You can't just sit back and say, hey, I just opened my store. I'm not telling them they can't come here, so it's not my fault. So part of it is to get all of the folks in the room and have those conversations where people can engage in a dialogue. So we did this in Memphis, and it was in relation to a coffee shop and a bike shop, and we got them to have the dialogue, and people realized that these new people are new people, but they're providing products and services that everybody can benefit from, even the people that have been there all along.
Okay, so the hardest part about moderating is you see everybody's hands and you see all the discussion and you really want to keep going, but I got the stop sign, y'all. So at this time, I'd like you to join me in thanking again our panel guests.